Hello and welcome to the Commune podcast. We will be talking about Axiom Verge this time. Joining me is Adrian. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
And with us is the developer of Axiom Verge, Thomas Happ. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good.
All right. It's great to have you. So, Thomas, have you been playing any games lately?
Well, as a developer, I hardly ever have the chance to play games. I did just spend an hour playing Hyperlight Drifter, although I'm not really sure, if I'm going to get to play it again. But yeah, that's just the way things go. The last game I tried to play before this was Mad Max, and it just took way too long. So, I don't know, we'll see.
The life of a developer is a busy one.
Yeah.
Oh,
Basically, no matter what you do, you feel guilty because if you're not playing games, you feel like you should be because you're a developer, but if you are, then you feel like you shouldn't be because you have work to do.
Oof.
man.
All right. Next, I wanted to talk about Axiom Verge itself. I think we all noticed that this game is pretty creepy. Each area has its own unsettling and distinct sights and sounds, and we were wondering, how did you come up with the themes for the areas?
So there's a loose kind of history to the world you're in, and what's happened there. So the different areas kind of reflect different parts of the history and different functions of the kind of complex that you're exploring. So starting from there, I had certain ideas okay, this area is going to have a lot of ventilation shafts, this area should have a lot of pipes with fluid going through them and that kind of thing. Some areas have ruins, and it was more or less, relates to the backdrop of the game.
So you were concerned with making a believable, livable environment that had come to ruins.
Yeah, I mean, and not just that it came to ruins, but there's layers of history in there. Some of it you could say is ruined because of warfare. Some of it is just old. Some of it is more recent, but no one's using it because they were recently, the events were recent, so everyone's dead, so to speak.
So, is there also any figurative significance to the areas?
This is probably still more literal than you mean, but yeah, there is an overarching theme of the interface between human and machine and analog versus digital, and then the things you see in the environment are derived from that to one degree or another.
I gotcha. Next, over the course of the story, Trace dies a handful of times. You could argue he dies in the opening sequence. He kills himself. Then Elsa Nova kills him, and maybe he dies in the end. So he dies a lot, even if the player doesn't run out of health. And I was wondering, is there any significant role that death plays in the story?
Yeah, it does. It's sort of barely touched upon in this game. You can tell that there's themes in there because you never exactly die. The player's mind is kind of like a bunch of little nanomachines, but the overarching theme is sort of one of what happens when consciousness ends and ceases, and it's sort of does it really even matter? Is it possible to perceive yourself as being dead? Well, no. So what happens? You just perceive nothing, or do you just transition into a new world that has some kind of MacGuffin to explain why you perceived yourself as dying. So, there's some themes like that in there, and if I make more sequels and that kind of thing in relation to this, probably those would explore it further than I did in this game. There's kind of too much to talk about in just one game, so I just limited it to the main character and what happened to him in the past.
That's cool.
Sure. So there's a sense in which death and the loss of self is a transition that Trace goes through.
Right, and it's kind of when you play the game, like you might say to yourself, "Oh, he didn't really die," but then again, that's a question, like what's the difference between, say, if you die or if someone just hit the pause button and then unpaused it? Are those two separate things? So in this kind of world, it's really like not going to be obvious which of those is the case.
I see. I think I see at least. Adrian, would you like to ask about combat?
So the question was about how you place enemies relative to platforms. Because with level design, especially for a Metroidvania, I sort of really doubt that you sort of just randomly throw them in there. So I wanted to know what was the thought process behind deciding, where to put things. In this case, being the enemies and platforms.
Well, I mean, it is really determined by like what abilities you have at each point in the game, and that really like determines, how high the platforms are going to be, and largely like where the enemies are going to be in relation to the platforms, and to some degree like what weapons you're going to be able to find. So there isn't really like a formulaic way to go about it. It's just a matter of like, playing through and like realizing, okay, like certain enemies aren't even going to be able to hit you unless they're in a certain place. Some enemies, you should give a way to like be able to come up underneath them. Otherwise, you're just going to die. Or some enemies need to give you a way to go behind them, or attack them from above. So that kind of feeds into like where the platforms go and where the enemies are placed.
Okay.
Something I noticed while playing the game, and something I've read in a couple of reviews, is that Axiom Verge gives you a lot of weapons, so you have a lot of options for manipulating enemies and getting them trapped behind ledges or corners or something like that. Is that what you're speaking about with giving the player different, a way to approach from behind or below?
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the weapons are geared around that. There's the one that can go through walls, and there's ones that can follow the walls and go around them, and others that can reflect off the walls. So this kind of thing changes where you're going to think about putting enemies, and also where you're going to think about letting the player find certain items. For example, like there's a place where there's a big vertical corridor that you climb up, and if you don't know the secret, then it's a big pain in the butt to climb up it. And then when you're going back down again, if you explored, you'd be able to find a weapon that kind of like fires downwards and creates a wall of flame, and that's like the perfect thing to use for that big shaft while you're going down.
Yeah, I never saw that gun, but then I saw someone using it on the, I think it's the third boss, and it made really short work of it, and I was jealous.
Yeah, I got a lot of them, but once you said Wall of Flame, is like, wait, I don't even remember a single fire weapon in this game, so I must have missed it.
Yeah, there's like 23 weapons, so it's kind of like only maybe 3 of them are actually necessary, but the rest of them all have a purpose and a reason that you'd want to use them over another weapon in certain situations.
I was also curious, most of the areas in the game only have one boss, but then towards the end of the game you get to Karma, and that doesn't have any bosses, but then you get to the final area, Mar Uru, and that has 3 bosses. So I was curious how you ended up deciding to pace the bosses, especially towards the end of the game.
In large part, the reason that there's more bosses in the one area and less in the other actually has to do with, towards the end of development, I had a boss that was planned, and I had actually drawn the pixel art for it that I really didn't like. I didn't think it fit in with the storyline that well, and so what I ended up doing was removing that boss and replacing it basically with Elsa Nova, and using the hours I planned to be developing that for her, so I could have that end boss sequence that you see. So that meant the place that boss was going to go into the Kerma, area. Once I did that, I knew I had a certain amount of time to finish the game, so I just I shifted my hours from doing that boss instead of making it so that I spent more hours to come up with a replacement for the boss. So, and then it's kind of the same thing with the final area. Once I changed it so that there wasn't going to be that one boss in Ikurma, it also ended up being that I kind of changed around when you encounter things during the game. So that basically meant that you encounter the Sentinel towards in the same area that you find the final boss. And then the third boss that's in there is just kind of a bonus.
The one that's a remix of the first boss?
Right. I mean, he's more of just a way of establishing these bosses aren't just unique characters. They can be kind of made at the whim of Aethatos. So that's kind of why that was there, just to give you the feeling oh yeah, there can be more of these guys than one of each kind, and you don't have to fight him. So there's that.
I'm so glad you said his name, because it makes me realize how stupid I sound that I've been pronouncing it Aethatos this whole time.
Well, I'm not sure, it comes from Aethatosis, so I guess it's Aethatos or Aethatos, but it's basically Greek, so you have to ask a Greek person, which I am not, the proper way to say it.
Yeah. Other thing I was curious, since you brought up a cut boss, basically, were there any enemies or weapons that you decided didn't fit in the game either?
Yeah, there was a lot. Originally, I had been planned. I thought I would make 100 weapons just because that seemed like a nice round number. But the thing is that when you have that many weapons, it just becomes overwhelming. You would just be constantly finding weapons, and then your weapon wheel would be too huge to even have a weapon wheel. So I'd have to have more of an inventory management, like an RPG. Oh, yeah. And I decided that just wasn't a direction I wanted to go into. Yeah, and there were lots of enemies, both enemies and bosses, that I decided I didn't like the look of, or I didn't want in there, that got removed. That's kind of par for the course, I think.
Right. So is that even the case with power-ups? Did you have things in mind more than just the lab coat and the grappling hook and things like that? Or did you get all the power-ups that you wanted to see in the final game?
Yeah, I basically ended up switching certain power-ups in and out for one another. Originally my thought was that the tendrils would be, have more of a role, and they could, whip out, and you could kind of, walk on them, on stilts, and they'd augment your jump, and then you could, climb along walls and stuff, like Dr. Octopus.
I was about to say that.
But that was really a problematic thing, because when you go that route, you have the decision the whole rest of this game is pixel based, so am I going to draw every single possible frame of animation for these tentacles, and every angle they could grab a surface? That would have just been it would have been the biggest animated feature in the game, would have been that at that point. Or do I want to have it be a polygonal object, and have some kind of inverse kinematics going into play? And I don't know, the more I thought about it, the more I started coming up with better ideas for things, and those ended up basically just getting replaced by the lab coat and whatnot.
Yeah, the lab coat and the drone, and even the teleport, I find are a really appealing set of power-ups, and I like how they expand on each other, and they all have their uses both in exploration and in combat. It's nice how that all fits together.
Yeah, they're definitely the things that make Axiom Verge unique and stand apart from Metroid, because none of those things are in Metroid at all.
Moving on, I wanted to talk about platforming in Axiom Verge. Axiom Verge is a pretty open game. You don't just usually go left to right. You can go any direction. And we were wondering how you communicated what direction the player might want to take.
you have to be sort of tricky when you're trying to steer the player different ways. I think usually the player wants to go from left to right, just because, in the Western world, that's how we read. And then, that's how, like, most video games tend to go, left to right, left to right and then bottom to top. So, like, anything other than that, you sort of need to be creative, and especially you need to find a way to have them encounter a thing that they want to get to but cannot in advance of them finding whatever it is. They can bypass it. So you never want a situation where, like, say it's a character that, there's an ability where they can swim. You don't want it to be like you find the flippers and then you find your first pool of water. You always need it to be the other way around. You need to have the player always wondering how they're going to get into the water, and then they find the flippers at some other point. So you have to be very considerate of that. And then not only that, but, like, a lot of times players will, like, even if they find the thing they need, they'll forget that they had it or that there's a way to use it. So a lot of cases you need to basically, like, drop them into a pit or lock them into a chamber where, the only way for them to get out is for them to, like, learn all the permutations of a new ability.
I was so glad Axiom Verge did that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different things that come into play, and you really need to put a lot of carrots in there to, like, put, like, shiny glowing items into the place that where you want the player to try to get, because otherwise they might, like, show no interest and just turn back, or they might even think that area is just, like, part of the background and not important. So yeah, it takes a lot of thought, and, like, also a lot of, like, going back and forth, like, watching people play and seeing the things that they miss and trying to figure out how you could, like, lead them the correct way instead.
Yeah.
It seems like one subtle touch in which you tried to maintain that sense of direction was just the reminders on the map screen. So I would usually put those down whenever I saw something fishy.
Yeah, that was a feature when I discovered. It was so wonderful, and then I forgot about it.
Yeah. I actually got docked. Like, a lot of review scores were like, reviewers were like, oh, like, why is there no map reminder? Super Metroid had map reminders. Why can't this game have them? And, I'm thinking, well, Super Metroid didn't have map reminders, but if people think that it did, I better have them. So, so those actually ended up getting added in later on.
Oh.
Well, I don't know if it was before the PC launch, but definitely after the PlayStation 4 launch.
Yeah, we're all playing on the PC version. So going a little deeper on that, you mentioned that you put shiny items wherever you wanted the player to go. And we were wondering, how did you decide where to put those shiny items? How did you pace them in order to give a sense of progress?
Like, I want to say that I basically put them evenly, but it's more than just that. Like, I sort of wanted to have every room in the game have some purpose, which actually ends up being, like, way too hard. Like, you just end up having some rooms that all they are is there's enemies in them and you kill all the enemies. But yeah, I think, like, the pacing was it was pretty organic. I looked a lot at, like, other games, like, for example, I did look at Super Metroid and, like, see how many items they had and, like, how often they doled them out. And I sort of used that as a starting point, but then I really ended up changing a lot of things, because there's actually a lot more hidden things and pickups than you find in Super Metroid. So then it became more of, you have your main items your main abilities that let you go new places. And then there's, like, items that you find in between time. And it was more like trying to make sure that every time you found a new ability, that there were some good uses for that, for you to find a bunch of different items using that. I think the exception is the password tool, which is sort of like a bonus. Like, it's not really needed for anything. But the main ones that you find, that you have to find and have to use, like, each one, if you were to, like, go back, you'd, like, find that while you were backtracking, you find a whole bunch of new places that you'd be able to use each one.
Yeah, that's an interesting balancing act you have to do.
Right, and like I had a big map, and kind of what I did was actually I numbered each of the main items, and then I numbered all the places where it would need to be used, so that like even before I knew what items I was going to have in the game, I had like an idea of the distribution of things, and like a way to see like if I made a mistake and had it be that there's a bunch of easy items that you could never ever get until you are like too far in the game, I try to change that around,
Okay.
Yeah, on my first playthrough, I got a much more even sense of the pacing because I would usually get stuck. I didn't know where to go, so I did a lot of backtracking and would uncover a good portion of the map anytime I got a new item. But on my second playthrough, I went just for the critical items, and I realized the very first time you have to backtrack from one area to another comes, I guess, at about a third of the way through the game, when you get the field disruptor or the high jump, and you have to go back an area in order to get the lab coat or the teleporting coat. So I was wondering, how did you decide when to place this moment? Why is it 4 areas into the game and not 3 or 5?
It's basically just like giving the player progressively more complex things you have to figure out. I mean, there is a small, the backtracking is very small. Like in the first room, you try to go right, you can't, so you end up having to backtrack. You get the gun and you go to the right, and it gets more and more convoluted after that. I'd say, like by the time you get the glitch ray, like that's put in a place where like it takes you around in a circle to where you might have been trying to go anyway. And so like at that point it's sort of like, okay, like you graduated, you've gone through like the tutorial and done the basic, you've learned the basic like there's hidden things for you to find and you have to use an ability to get past them, and now you're ready to have something more complicated happen to you, and that's basically what that's about.
So, in general, you would have it so that the player has a short tutorial session with the item, and then you loose them out on the world, and depending on how far into the game the player is, it will be farther from the tutorial to the next important point that the player needs to use the item, at least in order to progress the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a formula, but, I try to keep it open to that.
Right.
Okay.
I sort of recognize, like, okay, like, at this point, the player is, they're going to realize that they always encounter the thing that they can't get past before they find the solution. So by now, like, I trust that they're good enough at it that, when they find something this far away from their intended goal, that they'll know, they'll have thought, like, okay, like, let's see all those places that were too high for me to jump, and, like, I'll go back and try out every one of them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I interject with a question? It's about the password thing. Basically, how did that come about? And what was it that you felt the need to include it into the game?
It's sort of like, the original Metroid had a password save system where you could try and mess with it basically by like making your own passwords to see what would happen. But it's also meant to be sort of like the Game Genie, if you remember that, or the Action Replay, or Game Shark. I think there were a few different ones that were all the same sort of deal. And it's definitely one of those things that's like more for nostalgia than anything else. I don't really like picture it being like critical to the story or anything like that traces typing in passwords or whatever on his gun. But yeah, I thought people would like it. I wanted to give that whole like feeling of breaking the game and like doing something you're not supposed to do,
right?
As much as I could. So that's what that was about.
It was cool how it still like fit in with the game, because you have the address disruptor, which makes things look all glitchy. So imagining if the world of Axiom Verge could also be cheated with by entering passwords, that kind of thing still makes sense. Just something.
Yeah, I guess like in terms of the fiction, it's like that's the code that he's writing, or it's at least like the way the game genie worked was it would take an address in memory and then like a value to replace the data with. So it could be doing the same thing, but it's more like it's taking an electron out of the atoms and moving it to another place that something different that would work in the real world.
And it's nice how that works into some of the things that the story discusses about one's sense of identity, and that the address disruptor and all of these glitches are kind of about losing identity and having it replaced by something that feels off. So going back to traversal in Axiom Verge, there's a long hallway in the game that connects all of its major areas. What do you see as the pros and the cons of this type of shortcut as opposed to just having teleporter rooms?
The thing about teleporter rooms is that they discourage getting lost. So if you are forced to take the long route, so to speak, to get back to things, you're more likely to find, get distracted and like try and like find some hidden item, that kind of thing. And like that's what it's made for. That's like all of the enemies and such are balanced, assuming that the player does a certain amount of that. I feel like warping to a place, I don't want to say like it's cheating. It's more cheating in the way that I feel like you need to go here next markers that a lot of games have, or like Shadow Complex actually had an arrow telling you what rooms you had to go through to get to your destination. I feel like it ties into that. So I'd rather have any other way of doing things, than have a teleporter room. Like, and if I do want a teleporter room, like I definitely want it to be like it fits into the fiction, the characters teleporting. Like I know in Tomb Raider, like the most recent one, they had fast travel and you can go to different campsites and whatnot. But basically this means like you're supposed to think that she's actually walking there, but if she's doing that, she's like fighting wolves and things like that and climbing over like fallen rocks that you couldn't even get over if you tried to go there manually. So how does it happen? And that there was always a sort of like a discontinuity to me in the game mechanics. You have the mechanic of walking and that works. So it sort of like violates it and says, oh, that was just pretend all that work you did. Yeah, like now you can teleport. So.
Yeah. I feel like I can understand this point more. I remember I once, probably 2 or 3 years ago, I was in an argument with Richard Terrell over Xenoblade Chronicles. Basically, it had a lot of things that made the game snappier, but one of the things I guess that maybe he said or maybe he didn't is that it reduced its sense of the world. If you could just skip to any part of it, if you could just switch a dial to turn it to any point in time. I think Steve told me that too. And it's one of the reasons why they're very strict with that when they do that in either Metroid or Zelda, which is why those fast travels in those games appear much later once you've already traversed a good portion of the world to where, now it's okay. So I definitely feel like I can understand this point more, and where it's not just a convenience thing, it's part of a game and the world thing. And the things that you said about providing an opportunity for the player to get distracted and to experience other things instead of making it this mechanical push a button, I'm there now.
Yeah, I mean, like, one of my formative experiences, I think, as a kid was just being completely lost in Norfair, and the NES Metroid had no map screen or anything, and if you were to look at the map, like a lot of the rooms in there are kind of like nonsensical, they just exist to confuse you. And I don't necessarily agree that that's good, but like I remember feeling that the game felt so large and so epic as a result of just like how long it took me to make my way around the different areas. So, I think I kind of wonder if new gamers aren't being shortchanged by like how easy it is to get from place to place in new games and never have to explore. So I wanted to see what I could do to put that in there. But at the same time, like I wanted to have something, which is why I have the head that takes you from place to place. But it still is actually like you're still actually traversing, like your character can physically get off at any point. It's just that it goes faster than, in those classic games like Metroid and Super Metroid, where the only way is to just jump and jump until you've jumped all the way from Norfair to the ghost ship.
There's a certain satisfaction to getting on that head and shooting into the wind and seeing how fast you're going compared to your bullets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought of like, well, should I have the bullets carry inertia with the player, or should I have them like be left behind? And I don't know. What you see is what you get, and you can make some pretty patterns just by shooting your gun and watching how the bullets collect near each other in space.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who does that.
Yeah, I did that too.
What's also interesting is that certainly the map is dense to the extent that getting lost is always rewarding. Whether you find a new item or you just think of a new way to traverse the land, the teleporter in specific makes traversing old parts funner, just because you can pass through ledges now, and a hallway that might have taken 25 seconds now takes 23, and that's just a fun discovery in and of itself.
Yeah, I did my best, to try and make it so that the return journey was always much faster based, due to the upgrades you found. I'm sure there's places where I forgot to do that, but everything was considered like that. And I think if I make another game, like probably I'll be even more like hyper aware of, the need to do that. So I've definitely gotten a lot of good feedback since I've released the game, and thousands of people have played it and all have their opinions. It's pretty good.
Nice.
This one's kind of going back to the enemies, but this time it's more with like the particular enemy designs themselves. How do you decide what kind of enemies that you wanted in the game? I know you got zoomers. Some are inspired by the zoomers and the side hoppers, and I was kind of wondering, deciding what kind of enemies you want to put in the game, and how do you think about that? Because at some point, you can't just have enemies that move left and right anymore. You have to come up with, something else that moves in a different way and challenges you in a different way.
Yeah, like I knew I didn't want to have really complicated AI, especially with the side scroller, just because like it adds jumping into the mix. So if this was like a first person shooter or a third person game, like the expectation of modern players is that the enemies are going to be smart enough to try and flank the player, try to get behind cover, that kind of thing. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to try and get as far as I could with like, very simple things like, the enemies that just move up and down, or the enemies that just hone in on you. So there is a lot of repeated behavior, but you do find that there's a certain amount of emergence that comes through just like playing with it. Like, okay, like, the first time I ever made an enemy try to home in on the player, it was just sort of like you can see that there's some enemies in the the hallucination sequence that just home in on you and they detonate like bombs. But you get some emergent behavior if you change it to be like, well, if they get too close, they try to go away, or if you change it so that they have so much inertia that they need like a lot of braking distance. Well, then you get like the behavior of the bats that fly towards you, and they do this whole swooping motion. I didn't actually need to write any code called swoop. I just need to make them always try and get to the player, and the way they do that is they dive, and then they have so much inertia they have to swoop. And so you end up with like some interesting behaviors just by doing simple things. And that's kind of like what I tried to do as best as I could. The more complicated ones are, like the scorpion, because it knows to jump over you if you corner it, and it knows to like crouch every so often, and it knows to crouch if you've hit it in a place, you hit it in the head, or you hit it underneath, so now it knows it wants to crouch to block that, and that's about as like advanced as they get. I think most of it is just trying to find simple mechanics. There's the guys that they accelerate, and they shoot out at you, and then they hit the wall, and it takes them a while to recover and turn around.
Yeah.
You'll find that none of them are ever really trying to like get at you or flank you. I might try to do that in the future, but it's a really tricky problem to solve in 2 dimensions, just because they need to know how many platforms do they need to jump on to get you. Like, how do they know which platform they're going to need to jump on to get to the player if there's multiple platforms, but only one of them would let them reach you, you know? So.
Right.
All right. Getting to a more broad level, I wanted to ask what your goal was in developing Axiom Verge, and I was wondering if you would say that this game is in dialogue with Metroid, or how you would characterize its relationship to Metroid.
I was sort of trying to bring back or like elucidate the features of Metroid that have been kind of lost. So it's not necessarily, it was actually originally meant to be just like kind of my amalgam of like my favorite games and favorite game mechanics. Mm-hmm. But it's like specifically regarding Metroid, like I think the main thing that I liked about that game, and like also I guess like Super Mario Brothers that was kind of lost in Metroid, is the notion of everything being a brick. And like that kind of devolved, like you sort of necessarily, like when you get to Metroid Prime, where instead of everything being a brick, there are specific things that are highlighted that you're able to interact with, and the rest is a set piece. And then I feel like when they went back and went to Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission, that it was sort of like, when you look at the art to those, like it seems to be all around like hiding the fact that they're made of bricks. Like everything is meant to look painterly, and it's still tiled because that's how the engine works. But you get the feeling that the designers didn't want to work with a tiled engine. They were trying to make it look as not tiled as they could. And I felt like the fact that it looks tiled was one of the strengths to it. And like I feel the same way about Super Mario Brothers, like especially with, if you think about Super Mario Brothers 3, like some of the bricks come to life, and some of them you hit them and a coin comes out, some of them, a flower comes out, and it's communicated so well because everything is just a square shape. So that's like the main thing that I felt like I got from Metroid, was that, like, you could say like, well, the fact that it's this interconnected world, but that's almost more like, in a way, that's just how games are made. Like Metroid, Super Metroid was the first, but now, any action adventure always has that kind of map layout. So I definitely was trying to think, when it came to Metroid, like, how can I make like bosses that are as cool as Metroid? I don't think my bosses are as cool as Super Metroid's bosses, but I wanted to do my best, So like the Slug is definitely, I was trying to like have something be like as cool as Kraid was, like Kraid, you see his head, then he comes out of the ground, and he's so big he doesn't even fit on one screen. It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
But I know people say it's like Metroid, but the weapons and abilities are really not something for Metroid. Like I went for something a lot more actiony. So actually, like the controls and the guns are a lot more inspired by Contra. Than Metroid. I mean, the other thing about Metroid is that Metroid is this whole exercise in communicating without dialogue. I guess like the more recent Metroids aren't, but like Super Metroid was, it had that long exposition in the beginning, but once you got past that, there was no dialogue, and I think it's a much more contemplative, ambient, kind of like feeling the mood sort of game than Axiom Verge. Axiom Verge is meant to be a little more like verbal and cerebral, like there's an actual storyline, and things that you see and do feed into dialogue and story and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Trace will keep you company throughout the entire game, whereas Samus just kind of shuts up and you wonder what she's thinking.
Yeah, except that rare moment, like the very end of Fusion, where she actually has her own little profile picture and she actually talks. And I mean, like, not like talk to herself, like actual talk to someone else.
So I was wondering, beyond that, what would you say was your goal with Axiom Verge?
I mean, it started off as a hobby, and as a hobby, I was really just trying my best to have fun, like make a game that was fun to make and sort of epitomized like my favorite things in games. And that was really it. Like I couldn't even say at the time I had a goal to make money or anything, because I honestly didn't think that it would. So yeah, that was the main thing, just, to try and make something fun, that's fun to play, and that was it. I did have, like, at the time, I had these ideas. I was thinking, trying to figure out how to express, like, my thoughts on, like, the nature of consciousness and whatnot. And like I said, like, I meant to those sort of, like, come into play in sort of like the larger universe, but in Axiom Verge, it didn't really come through. Like, it didn't really serve the game that well to belabor. Is it belabor or belabor at that point?
I think it's belabor.
Yeah, so, I didn't really go into it, but you saw, like, hints of it, like, in the beginning when Trace dies in that intro sequence, and then, like, later on when, like, he questions whether he's still his self. Like, that kind of thing I was actually, like, thinking about a lot, like, how would I make that into a game. But I think in some ways, like, the game that would be about that directly, like, having mechanics about that, wasn't really the game I wanted to make anyway, because I wanted to make a game where you explore and find things and you shoot monsters and stuff at the time. So,
Right. So, what are the ways you think you might have improved on Metroid or the entire Metroidvania sort of design?
well, it's interesting. I think like the main thing that I did wasn't necessarily to reinvent, but to just like one of the main messages I had was, like, don't fight what your game is trying to communicate. Like, don't fight it with the graphics or anything. Like, let all your graphics and all your sound and all your art play into the game design, and, like, try to embrace things like, in this case, like, tiles was one of the main things I was really trying to push and bring that back, so to speak. The idea of each tile having properties, and it not being something that you try to hide or be ashamed of. And so I guess that's one thing. I think there's probably a lot of little things. Like, I read a lot of reviews where people say, like, oh, this game has, it feels like a classic game with the modern conveniences. And I wasn't thinking of that necessarily when I was making it, like, oh yeah, the modern conveniences. But there are certain things, like, I sort of feel like the notion of the player dying and restarting, like, you never died and now you're trying again, it's kind of like a weird crutch. So I don't know. I don't think I solved it quite yet, but I like it better the way it is, in this game, where there's a reason that he comes back to life. I think it'd be better if I can make a game where, like, you just don't have to die, but it still has challenges. That's a tough one. I think a lot of, like, what it probably brings to the table is more like just like a message to other game developers to say, like, yeah, like, you can go out and make your own game. Like, you don't have to get anybody's permission to go and make the game you wanted to make. Like, a lot of people, like, I see, they get out of college and then they try to form a team and then they have no money. And this was more like, I didn't worry about that. I just started doing it. I worked all the way through on, other things to pay my bills.
When I read your story about developing the game, it actually kind of reminded me of Pixel, and reading about him developing Cave Story in his off hours after work.
Yeah, and I think, like, I kind of want to tell people, like, in a lot of ways that was the best way to do it, because when you're doing that, you're really thinking of this as, like, this is something that's fun, and you're not entirely, like, motivated by greed, or not even greed. Like, if you're working for a commercial game company, a lot of times you're just working because you're scared of the company going under, whereas if it's just your hobby and you can kind of enjoy it, I think it helped the game. It benefited the players as well as the game to do it that way. And I'm hoping that we see, like, more and more people out there, like, not give up on their dreams on the outset. Like, don't think to themselves, oh, this is way too hard, I just won't even try. Like, maybe now they'll be like, well, Pixel and this other guy, Tom Happ, like, both made a game, so maybe I can too.
Yeah, it really is inspiring to me, because making games is something I want to do as well, which is why this interview, I just had to jump on this opportunity.
All right, and One last question. This question is required of everyone we interview. When it comes to the theory of video game design, what do you consider the most important? Is it the game itself, the role of the developer, or the perspective of the player?
I don't know. I mean, for me, it's like 70% how much do I enjoy it, like making the game fun to design, and then the other 30% is trying to make it fun for the players. Because if it's fun for the players but not fun for me, then I feel like I failed and I should go do some other job.
All right, that makes sense. Adrian, was there anything else on your mind?
No, although I might have another situation where, there's a question I forget to ask. It's like, shit, I should have asked some other part about the game. Like, I don't know, pixel art or something. But so far, none at the moment.
All right. Games are complicated, and we could talk about them all day, I'm sure.
Yeah. Although I do seriously want to know about the pixel art. How do you do that? It's like, did you do that all yourself?
Yeah. I did do like different methods for like the larger creatures. I actually had to draw them with a pencil and paper, then scan them, and then clean up the pixels because it's stuff that you scan looks like messy as hell. And then for like smaller things, I basically just went in with the mouse and clicked away. For anything that's like 32 by 32 or smaller, you can do it that way. I can do it that way, I mean.
And you even did the sound effects on your own too? Like sound effects, like that's something I've never done at all. Like I don't know how you do that.
There is a software called BFXR. I think there's SFXR and BFXR. Let's see if I can remember which one. Yeah, just search for BFXR, and what this does is basically give you a bunch of tools for generating blips and bleeps, and it's great. And once you get used to it, you get used to making an impressive variety of different sounds just with the same waveforms. So I would largely take that, and then I would go into like SoundForge or something and actually add stereo or other effects to them. But that was the main thing.
Wow. So how much time did you put into practicing for that before you really felt comfortable?
I wouldn't say I really practiced at it. I just started making bad sounds and I would use them. And like over time, I got better at it and I could start replacing sounds. But yeah, I didn't spend a lot of time like being like, oh, I need to get better at this before I can do it. I felt like it was more important just to get started and make the thing I wanted to make. And as I was doing it, I got better. And then, of course, like I had to go back and, because I hadn't been doing pixel art before, so I needed to, once I got to the end of the game, go back and like, oh, I need to correct the pixel art in the beginning because now it looks horrible to me. And, the same goes for the sound effects.
It instills a lot of confidence in me. Just wanted to let you know that.
To me, I feel like that's the main thing that trips people up is that just, it took me 5 years to make this game. And I think a lot of people feel like if they aren't instantaneously good at something, that it means that they're bad and they should just stop. But it's, it's more like, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And the way I thought about it was like when I first read about Pixel, I read it took him 5 years to make his game. And when I read that, I thought if I'd started making a game 5 years ago, I would have had a game now and I'd be like Pixel. So then I was like, okay, I'd better start making one now. So 5 years from now, I don't think that same thing again. And I think that's, it. You just find something you think you might be interested in. You might not be good at it, but if you like doing it and you keep at it, like eventually you're going to get good.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Thomas. Is there anything you would like to get the word out about?
Yeah, let's see, a number of things. So one, Axiom Verge is coming out for PlayStation Vita on April 19th. That will be cross-buy with the PlayStation 4 version, so if you get it on one platform, you get it on the other. It's also 10% off the first week. In Europe, it comes out on the 20th. We also, just today, IndieSocks.com came out with Axiom Verge socks. So I think it's like
$25 gets you a pack of socks. Like they have Axiom Verge socks, Super Meat Boy socks, Ultimate Chicken Horse socks.
Hello?
Hello.
Ah, okay. So, sorry about that. You were explaining indie socks and how there's Super Meat Boy socks.
Yeah, and did it cut out before I started talking about the Xbox One and Wii U?
Yes, it did.
Versions? Okay. So for those that don't have a PlayStation system, the Wii U and Xbox One ports are in progress. We hope to have them done by the summer sometime. We haven't committed on a date or anything, but I'm going to be at PAX East, and I should have both of those platforms with me, and you can play a demo of them. So come by, and we're supposed to even have posters and T-shirts there as well.
So, Thomas, where can we find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter. I'm at Axiom Verge, and the Facebook page is just facebook.com/Axiom Verge.
All right. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good day.
All right, you too. Thank you.